I want to welcome up our next session. Of course, we're going to stay on politics and talk politics and climate ahead of the 2024 presidential election. So to moderate, please join me in welcoming Justin Worland, senior climate correspondent for Time Magazine, and panelist Alejandro Alba, senior correspondent at NowThis News, Amy Goodman, the founder of Democracy Now!, Vanessa Hauc, an anchor at Telemundo and director of the program Planeta, Tierra, and Al Ortiz, a longtime and recently retired executive and former VP of Standards at CBS News. Please join me in welcoming them.
Well, testing the, Okay. Well, thank you for the introduction. Glad to be here. I have to say, I remember being in this room 4 years ago at the launch of Covering Climate Now, and it's amazing to see how the organization has grown. Thrilled to be talking about politics and the 2024 election and climate change. Obviously, a lot is at stake, and we've got a great group here to dig into how we can cover this. And I'm just going to dive right in with a question for Amy. You know, obviously this panel assumes that covering climate in the context of the election is important, but I just want to start with you and ask, why is that the case? You know, do you agree with that assumption, and why?
Yes. First of all, it's a great honor to be with all of you. This is such a critical issue. I just came off of hosting Democracy Now! We do it down the street from 8 to 9 every weekday morning. And this week, the main focus, of course, has been climate. From the tens of thousands, perhaps over 70,000 people that marched on Sunday, being there out in the streets, talking to people beyond the government officials, though it is critical to bring those voices to that questioning of government officials, and then being out there at the protests that were taking place, the shutting down of the banks and the hundreds. In one protest, 149 people who were arrested. And I think my point here as we move into this key election year is to bring out the voices of people at the grassroots who are most deeply concerned about this. At Democracy Now! We say, going to where the silence is, because I really think that is the majority voice. Look at the first Republican, vice presidential primary debate, or was it the presidential primary debate, whatever, who will be running with Trump. The video of the question of the young Republican man who asked Ramaswamy about, or the question went to Ramaswamy, and now he calls climate change a hoax. This cuts across the political spectrum. So all the work you all do around climate, you are not speaking to set chorus at this point. It's just some people who are willing to hear. It's generational, and of course older people also care. It's a learning moment where the candidates, you don't often get to see these public officials who've occupied public office having to respond to people in the street, people at town halls. And so this is the moment also for journalists to focus the questions on climate change. I mean, to say the least, we have had extreme weather events all over the world, so there's not a lack of coverage of weather. But also to demand of, for example, the meteorologists. That's why people tune into radio and TV, to find out what to wear, or can I go outside tomorrow? They talk about the rain, the drought, the torrential weather that we may be, who knows, experiencing this weekend. But to link it always, never take for granted, since you know so much about climate change, always to link these events when that is appropriate to climate change. We see the words extreme weather at every news desk. Well, there should be another two words, and that is climate change. It's absolutely critical for people because, as Noam Chomsky says, the media manufactures consent. And so it sets the agenda. I'll just end by saying I was on a panel with Bob Schieffer in few years ago talking about the issue of climate in the 2016 presidential debate. That was the standoff at Standing Rock. Thousands of people, this epic gathering as they were protesting the Dakota Access Pipeline. Democracy Now! Went out there. In the general election debates, there was not one question on climate change. And I asked Bob about this. He said, okay, we've made a mistake. But when journalists ask those questions, it also legitimizes the issue so that people feel like they're not interrupting things to say this is a critical, if not the critical issue of the day.
Excellent. That lays the ground really well, and we'll pull on some of those threads. Al, I want to go to you, and I have to look at my notes to get your resume right. You were Washington bureau chief at CBS. You were executive producer on the Evening News, vice president of Standards. So you have a lot of you've had a long tenure working with the network's elections coverage.
A lot of scars, yes.
A lot of scars. Can you help us understand some of the obstacles to actually getting climate as part of elections coverage?
Well, the issue has been in the past that the polling has indicated that it is not the top issue on voters' minds when they're polled. Oftentimes it's the economy, it can be the price of gasoline, it can be more immediate things, but it's been moving up. And there's been quite a bit of change, I would say, in the last 5 years, over the last 10 years, in terms of people's interest in it. If you look at a poll from 4 years ago, 8 years ago, there wasn't a climate change question on the poll. Now they're in there. They're not always the first question, but that information is in there. People are asking themselves. There's a lot of information that you can, a lot of research that you can do in preparation for election coverage that can really help you. And studying what the polling shows and starting to show is really, really important. Not only that it's moving up in terms of an issue that people care about, but if you look at the breakdown of ages and groups of voters, the generational thing just shines through. I mean, clearly it's a bigger concern for younger voters. And that information is all in there. It just needs to be harvested and brought out and reported on. Just like right now, I mean, I think the most important thing to do to prepare for an election is to really do the research, get it right, study the records, the climate records, and what they say and what they do of the various candidates. You can also find out who's contributing to these campaigns, and what kinds of companies, what kind of business interests are behind these campaigns. To me, it's striking that if you look at one party, there's not one candidate that has taken a stand really on climate change, as opposed to the other party who, even though the progress that the Democrats have made may leave us impatient, may not be enough to satisfy us, it's been something, and it's been worth noting. And you really can't lose sight of what's at stake is whether that continues to go forward or whether it's brought to a standstill for another 5 years.
Yeah, very, very important points. I want to turn to something you said about audiences. And I think there's sometimes a view that there's a monolithic audience that isn't interested in climate. And as you said, there are maybe some groups that are. And turn to Alejandro and ask, you work for NowThis, younger audience. What are you seeing in terms of interest in climate from younger, your audience?
Yeah, they care. They're extremely passionate. They're the people, for the most part, that turned up on Sunday to protest. But not only do they show up, they lead and they organize. They're just born passionate, and they do care about policy. They're constantly advocating about policy. And with our coverage specifically, we always try to make it personal, because there tends to be sometimes in our comments we'll see where like, oh, y'all are just like liberal media, or like you're pushing an agenda, and it's like, well, no, if we take away kind of the politics a little bit and just make it specific to the people, to the youth, and what they're dealing with, the impact that they're having, it makes it a little bit more digestible and more engaging. And these groups of youth, they have a lot of power, purchase power with their like parents and their family too. So they're influencing other ideologies and mindsets of older generations. So they care, they engage, and they help us push the importance of the climate crisis, really.
Great. And I would ask the same question to you, Vanessa. What are you seeing the audience at Telemundo? Are they engaged? What are you seeing?
Well, they are absolutely engaged, and as you have heard during all this conference, climate change is affecting everybody, but it's not affecting everybody equally. So it's disproportionately affected vulnerable communities, among them the Latino community. So, for example, for Latinos, half of the Latino population live in the 25 most polluted cities in the country. And our children are 40% more likely to suffer from asthma. So, and when we talk about our countries of origins, when we're hit by a natural disaster like Hurricane Maria in Puerto Rico, or many others that had hit Central America, or the droughts in the dry corridor, we don't have the resources to rebuild as easily as other countries. So for us, it's something that is very, very, very important. And the wonderful thing in the Latino community is that that is a message that really resonates with us, because we are somehow connected to nature at a DNA level, and I see it when I do the stories at Noticias Telemundo. They're very well received because we have that connection. I remember when I was growing up, I will go to the market with my grandma, and we will never take a plastic bag. We will always take a little sack called costal to bring the groceries. And I remember my dresses were my sisters, and then they will go to my cousins, and this was just the way our culture is. So I think it really resonates with our community. And when you talk about voting, 9 out of 10 Latinos are actually willing to vote on legislation to protect the planet, even if it means paying more taxes. So we have to be creative as journalists to be able to tell this story in a way that it is compelling, that it has the facts, the numbers, but it also has that human voice that really gets to the heart of the people in a way that we can see it, we can plant a seed of concern that is authentic and that is powerful, that can really motivate change and action.
Great. Well, I just want to ask one follow-up. You were in 2020 the first climate journalist to help moderate a presidential debate. And I don't really have a very specific question, but I just want to know about what that experience was like, and what learnings you took from that are applicable perhaps to other national audiences.
It was very explosive, to say the least. It was the only debate that we have Mike Bloomberg on. So it was an amazing opportunity. I've been covering climate for the past 20 years, and for me, it's a very, very personal issue. So I felt a great responsibility. I really wanted to bring climate to the center stage, and I really wanted to give it substantial time for candidates to be able to explain what were their plans and what were their proposals to face this existential crisis that we're facing. But I knew also that historically climate is not a priority on a debate stage. In the 2016 election, Donald Trump and Hillary Clinton only talked about climate for about 5 minutes. And the 2012 election, President Obama and Mitt Romney didn't even mention the subject. So I was very concerned. I really prepared my questions. I pitched 20 questions to our leadership, and really push forward our teams to understand that this was the issue of our times, really the subject that we needed to talk about. And I was very, very fortunately that our leadership at Telemundo, at NBC and MSNBC and CNBC, that were the ones that organized the debate, they were on the same page, and they understood the science, and they they understood that this was an important matter for the audiences. So we end up asking 10 questions about climate and talking for 20 minutes about it, and it was unprecedented.
Yeah, it's great. I want to go to something, Al, you said about, you said it very clearly. There's one party that maybe is moving too slowly but is engaged, and there's one party that's not. As a climate journalist, I feel totally comfortable writing that, saying that. I don't have some of the same fears, perhaps, that a political journalist might about being branded as too partisan, or perhaps not having any Republican sources who will speak to them. How do you, on a very sort of practical level, how do you advise a reporter who's grappling with how to communicate honestly on this issue and on where the parties are and where candidates are, but they're concerned about being able to do their job?
I think you stick to the facts. There is a natural reluctance by professional journalists, including those of us who are reporting on climate. There's a natural reluctance to get into something that's political, that we feel like we're going to be tarnished by, as if we're taking sides in the election over something that's the science behind it's incontrovertible. But I think we have to get over that. It is a political story. It is partly political. It involves making tough political choices, tough economic choices, tough social choices, changing policies, tax policies. There's a lot of political decisions that have to go into this. And I think it's unrealistic to think that you can just approach it from a clinical, scientific point of view. Here are the facts, everybody's going to make up their own minds. The fact is that if you have, I'm going to go out on a limb here, but the fact is that if you have the Republican Party take over both the executive and legislative branches of government, you're going to stop climate change policy in the government for 5 years. And we don't have 5 years to lose. We're way past that. And I think it's important to remind people of that. And you're not going to get that in every story. You're not going to get that in every debate. But the fact is, the timing thing is so urgent that I think you need to be clear about the fact that these are, one side is on one side of the issue, and the other side's on another, at least making some progress, and that it's not something that can be depoliticized.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's important to stick to the facts, and finding a way to just articulate what the stakes are without sounding partisan. Did you want to
add something?
jump in?
Just look at what Mark Hertzgaard did. This is a Biden climate
Yes.
person, and it's doing the exact same thing with the Republicans and the Democrats, and that is challenging them, asking them questions, whoever's in power, who's ever setting the policy. I think you are consistent across the board. It doesn't matter which administration is in. And also, just responding to something you said, Al, about how, the concern of media outlets over the years that people's eyes glaze over when you ask something about climate change, though it's changed over the years. When we were covering the standoff at Standing Rock, we got video footage, came back, posted it online of these protests against yet another pipeline being built, the Dakota Access Pipeline. Within 24 hours, there were 14 million views of what was going on. And I think that showed that people around the globe and the United States deeply do care. And it's not just an evolution on the part of the electorate that we should catch up with. The media also affects people's interests. Like you're asking those questions, which was so critical, ignites people's interest and fuels the next question to be asked. And it taps into an audience that really does care and knows it's legitimate to ask about these things. When we were covering the Paris Climate Agreement, we went to the UN Climate Summit, and Democracy Now! Goes every year. This year, it's in UAE, right? The president will be the head of the UAE oil corporation, which is absolutely astounding, which has to be raised at every moment. We're moving into this election year. Everyone should be talking about this as we talk about how the planet, the US, China, etc., deals with the climate crisis. When we were covering Paris in 2015, that was right after the Bataclan massacre, terrible terrorist attack. So all the anchors of the news shows went to Paris. So when we're coming into the airport for the climate summit, they're all leaving. And I thought it's appropriate that they came here to anchor from Paris. They're concerned because so many people died, were killed. Absolutely, that was legitimate. But why aren't they staying? Look at the effect of the climate catastrophe and the number of people who die around the world. Why didn't they stay for this seminal climate summit, 2015, the Paris Agreement? And we have to make it unacceptable for journalists, even general political journalists, not to ask questions, about these issues. And also, again, hold meteorologists' feet to the fire. That when they talk about extreme weather, and I'm just going to keep hammering away at this because the more, many of those meteorologists were climate deniers. You have Chad Myers, who just wrote a piece a few years ago. He said, yeah, okay, I was. And I'm slowly changing, he said. But when you look at CNN's coverage, so I'm not talking about Fox, that calls climate change a hoax. I'm talking about CNN, I'm talking about NBC. When you look at their coverage, it's how many times they raise that issue, especially with weather. Don't assume people link these very diverse weather events. It's up to us to do that.
Excellent. I lost my train of thought. The one thing I wanted to add on to what Al said, and then I'm going to come back to something that you said, Amy, but is separating advocating, or not advocating, but pushing for or saying that we need action on climate and advocating for a particular solution. And I think that's, for me, something that I find very useful in saying it's not about A policy or B policy that we need to enact, but we do need to do something. I see a look of skepticism, but I think it's a important point as a journalist to say you can advocate for the climate in a broad sense, but I'm not advocating for any particular policy. My personal perspective. There was something that you said, Amy, about I can't remember whether it was Keystone or Dakota Access. You said Dakota Access, where you got a lot of engagement. And I think there's this myth that climate stories don't resonate. Perhaps it's true in some abstract sense if we write about levels of carbon dioxide, but there are ways to find engagement. So we have about 5 minutes before we go to audience question. I would love to hear from each of you about story threads coming up that you think will have resonance with audiences, things that you're working on, and perhaps that others might also pick up on those similar threads. And we can just start with you, Alejandro, and move along.
Well, something, because I'm working on it right now, but it's kind of breaking down the project 2025 and just visualizing it. Because with a lot of stories, I think within the environment and climate, we see a lot of stats, we see a lot of figures, and sometimes it just stays at that. And so what we try to do at NowThis, and because we have a very specific, unique platform, is trying to visualize it with people and actually humanizing all of these news. So what the IRA has done, and then what this plan would take away.
And just Project 2025, most of you probably know, but it's the conservative plan to take everything back.
Yeah. So basically ways to dismantle all the progress that has been done, specifically within climate and environment, the IRA. So I'm finding ways to visualize what we would be losing if this would to be enacted. And I think that's a good way to visualize. And if we find key players that would be impacted, that would resonate a lot with our audiences and people beyond.
Do you think there's a lot of talk about sort of optimism versus anger versus different emotions you might stoke, or that readers might latch onto in a story? And so do you find, are you thinking that you'll activate anger in people thinking about Project 2025, or is that part of your thinking?
Yeah, I mean, it's funny that you say that, because emotion is something that we think about a lot. All of our audience constantly is talking about climate anxiety, climate hope, climate anger. Again, our audience is very, very passionate, which is a good thing. And I I think both. I think one could lead to the other. So I think it could start with anger. And sometimes, I do present a story with a certain way, like, hey, this might piss you off, but wait, hold on, there is a solution, or there could be hope. There could be a conversation. It's not just stopping at doom and gloom, because then we're not going anywhere with that.
Great. Amy?
One is following the money, especially during not only the presidential race, but at every level, who is funding these candidates. And also, especially with the corporate media, I'm sure it's very difficult for you, those of you who work in it, because of the amount of advertising that comes from the very institutions that are financing, the whole climate change crisis. And following the lead of young people as they go after banks, in the same way you go after government officials, follow where they are going. I get the feeling in certain newsrooms that people who propose stories, there's going to be this protest on this day, feel that they get marginalized as they climb the ladder in their newsroom if they say, I want to go cover this. That's exactly where you should go to. It's not just when a government policy is announced. Let those people who are deeply concerned about this set the agenda as well. Those are news events. And again, as we lead to this climate summit in the UAE, one of the things we'll be focusing on is the global connection. It's something that unites people around the world, and as Vanessa pointed out, it's absolutely critical to talk not just about the frontline communities, but the fence line communities who are closest to these fossil fuel plants, communities of color, the poorest communities in our country and around the world.
Great. Vanessa?
Well, I think climate is definitely a systemic issue that is affecting every single aspect of our lives. So as you just say, Amy, we need to connect the dots for audiences. So it is a political story, obviously, because we are choosing the people that are going to lead the policies that are going to make a difference and set up the platforms for all of us citizens to live sustainable lives. So it depends a lot on us that we have an educated audience that can actually vote on those people that are going to have their best interests in mind. It is an economic story because it affects every family. It is, everything, like the food that we put on the table, the droughts that are happening in Central America, they are affecting the United States because we are seeing climate migrants that are coming here because they have no other way to go after 2, 3, 4 years that they lost everything that they have, all their harvest. So I think that when we connect the dots and we really go in depth, we're able to tell a story that resonates with the audiences. And I think the climate story is not an easy story. We have to be creative. We have to look for beautiful images, for compelling stories, for powerful voices. We have to look at the data, as you just mentioned, the numbers. We have to find scientific experts that can tell the story in a clear way. So there is a lot of elements, but I think without a doubt that this is the most important story of our times. So I just invite you all to really get involved and do great journalism because it's a great challenge, but it's also a great opportunity for us.
Okay, great. And we'll have Al, and then we'll go to audience questions, so think about questions.
One thing that you mentioned, Vanessa, I think one of the compelling political stories of this cycle is immigration, and it's one where the connection is not often drawn to climate change. The fact is that these waves of immigration that we see happening in various parts of the world are happening because of crop failures, because of agricultural policies that are going awry, because there's not enough water falling. I mean, there's a lot of it's not the only problem, the cause of immigration problems and these migrations, but it's a connection that needs to be made and that we need to make. I just want to say I'm very mindful of the fact that we're going out to a lot of countries and different organizations. We are so fortunate in this country to be doing these jobs under the protection of the First Amendment. And it's just something that not a lot of societies have. I know I have colleagues who, if they were to question their government's policies on climate, on immigration, whatever, they could be silenced or worse. We have that protection, and therefore we have that obligation to raise this, keep it prominent in the public eye, to make the connections that we're talking about, and we really need to lead because we have that ability in our profession here in this country. I really think we have a special responsibility to push that through.
Very important. I actually want to make one addition, just because this is on my mind, and I think it's something I hope other journalists follow, is the nascent push from Republicans to link climate policy with inflation. And you see this across the country in communities, conversation about, oh, your energy prices are spiking because of climate policy. And I think that misinformation is something that people should be paying attention to, particularly in local communities where these things are likely to catch on. Sorry to just, you had such a good comment to end on, but I felt that was an important story thread to follow. So, okay, questions. We'll go up here.
Hello. Oh, thank you. My name is Camille Padilla from 9 Millones in Puerto Rico. And first of all, thank you so much for this panel. And I'm really thinking about who gets to report about climate and in the context of election too. How important do you think, you're talking about covering communities on the ground, that the reporters share those experiences, understand, are connected? How do we make sure to have inclusive newsrooms of the people who are most affected by this?
It's a good question. Does anybody want to take it?
I could think of, again, just kind of living within the uniqueness of social media and going with the trends of just, for example, like now everything's presented in like the TikTok way, right? It's just like selfie, you talk to the camera, green screen in the background. It's like knowing when to pass the mic. Not I, as an on-camera correspondent, I don't always have to tell the story. I now have the ability to literally just give my phone to someone and help them tell their story. So just literally offer your platform. I think that is something that I'd like to see more across the board. It doesn't always have to be the reporter telling the story. And I think we are now, as a society, able to do that more, just lending out platforms.
I would like to ask Camille that, is absolutely vital to have diversity in our newsroom, because when things are happening in our communities, in our own communities, well, no, first of all, it's about representation. The Latino population is growing. We have an African American community that is strong, and we need to have representation of all those voices in our newsroom. But also, when a tragedy hits Puerto Rico, for example, who else than you that know that community, that know what they are going through, is going to be best to tell the story of that community? So definitely there is no climate justice, and we have here over and over again in this conference, without representation, without diversity, and without inclusion. So I think all those aspects definitely needs to be incorporated into our news departments.
It's absolutely essential. It's an absolutely key issue, both in your newsroom being represented and also the people that you interview, because that's who people see on TV and radio and on social media, that you have this great diversity of voices.
Great. Another question, okay.
Hi, given that a lot of the people that are the most passionate about climate change aren't old enough to vote yet, and I was one of those people not that long ago and remember that feeling deeply, how can we as journalists help those people as the election, which can be a very stressful time when you feel helpless and like your voice doesn't matter, have a playbook for influencing their families and helping their families understand why this issue matters more to them than, say, the economy, or say whichever issue is at top of mind for their parents but isn't at top of mind for the younger generation in the house?
Another good question.
Well, what is your name? Nina, great to meet you. Thank you for the question. I think, you have a very powerful voice. I'm a mother, and really in my home, the boss is my 2-year-old daughter. I'm a 28-year-old boy. So really, I think definitely, I mean, your generation understand and really gets what the problem is and the great challenge that we have. You are fighting for a livable planet. And that is something that we all, I mean, the older generation here, we never have to do. So I think the best advice would be to educate yourself and to really understand the climate crisis and talk to your parents about it and talk to your community and talk to your uncles and your grandpas and let them know why this is so vital. And I'm sure that you will be able to find common ground, because there is nothing that we love more than our children. And I'm sure that they will be able to understand your message and the importance of it.
I think it's very similar to the question about diversity. I think that just as you need to have diverse people in the field reporting on areas that are suffering some of the worst consequences of climate change right now, you also need to seek out stories about younger voters and younger people who are voting for the first time, or who have families, just starting families, and as I said, the polling data is available. You can find this stuff out and identify targets to go after, but I think you have to intentionally seek out these people and give them voice in your stories.
We just covered the major decision out of Montana, the lawsuit brought by, I think it was a group of young people from the ages of 5 to 22, who sued the state of Montana for violating their constitutional rights to be able to live in the world for a sustainable future, and they won. So there's all sorts of things they can do outside of voting, and all of those things affect those who vote as well, and being involved in organizations and clubs and protests. Also, I just want to say it's very important for journalists to accept how people define themselves. For example, at Standing Rock, they did not call themselves protesters. They called themselves water protectors. They call themselves land defenders. And that is critical. It changes the whole frame of what they are doing.
Great. Okay.
Amy, I so appreciate that you brought up so many different actions as examples throughout this panel. I mentioned yesterday I've been on the front lines. My name is Jen Thompson. I'm from SJN, but I'm really not speaking on anybody's behalf but my own. But more specifically in Portland, Oregon. So through the murder of George Floyd, rallies for Stop Asian Hate, increased actions for the Land Back movement, even actions in solidarity for the Atlanta forest where they're trying to build Cop City. All of these spaces in which I've experienced and witnessed really heavy police violence. Thinking about climate, how imperative it is to acknowledge intersectionality in this space. How do you all feel about involving cops at climate protests by obtaining permits for actions? Do you feel like it potentially alienates marginalized folks from having the accessibility to attend? And do you feel it's imperative for cops to be around in order for journalists to successfully do their jobs?
This is COPs versus the UN COP, the Conference of Parties, the UN Climate Summit.
Police.
I just want to say one thing about Cop City. That's a perfect example that in Atlanta, they are trying to build the largest police training facility in the country. And when you talk about intersectionality, all the different groups, whether we're talking about those who are countering police violence, to environmentalists and indigenous people who are deeply concerned about the environment it is being built in, to those who want to have the whole Atlanta community have a vote, a referendum on whether this should happen and whether the money should be going there or to preserving the climate, etc. It is key that we see increasingly the issue of how all of these issues are interrelated, and so often climate is a part of that. And to heighten that, those expressions, because it's usually the gamut across the political spectrum, across groups, religious groups as well, that take on all of these issues together and don't let that one be very conscious as climate reporters. I mean, even to call yourself a climate reporter, I think you're a general reporter who's deeply concerned about the issue of our day. I mean, what did Antonio Guterres say this week? Humanity has opened the gates of hell.
Great, okay.
Hi, my name is Rebecca Weston. I'm from the Climate Psychology Alliance of North America. I'm not actually a journalist, but I'm so moved by some of the questions here and sort of following up on some of those. My perspective is that if we don't address the deep anxiety and the overwhelm that is happening around the country, not only are we missing the activists, but we're not tracking the very serious and deadly right-wing responses that are starting to happen. And I'm thinking about eco-fascism. I'm thinking about the level of militarization that's happening at protests. And I'm curious how the media is wanting to connect, not just on the left, but the right-wing responses that are doubling down, not just sort of in the softer denialism, but actually starting to turn it into a forceful, we have a right to be taking over our property, we have a right to exclude. And I'm curious if people can make the connection more explicitly to potential authoritarian and fascist threats, which I think are which are rising. We know they're rising. I'm curious how you guys would respond to that.
Well, I'll respond to it briefly just because this is an area that I'm actively thinking about and reporting on. I think it's so important. I think it's one of the, I think it's, if you look at what's happening in Europe, where they spent a lot of time thinking about, how can we meet our 2050 targets and where does that mean we need to be, and then they've made climate policy around that, and that's had some social effects, which has then led to political backlash in places like the Netherlands, Spain. This is really serious. I mean, how do we report on that? I think, the challenge, of course, is trying to get the real life connections, the people on the ground who are going to show how serious and dangerous this is. And I think one of the challenges, I think there are a few challenges. One, I think there's sort of a embedded skepticism from, at like an editor level about drawing those sorts of connections. And then two is making it non-academic, because there's a lot of research about this, but it really, needs to enter the sort of bigger narrative. And so, I guess I would say we just kind of have to do the reporting, and I'm keen on that. I think that others should be too. So that's my response. Okay.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for being here. I think the theme of connection seems to be coming up a lot in this panel. And I just want to go back to something that was brought up at the very beginning. Al, you mentioned that debates and things, if we're going back to the political polling of audiences, you're talking about the price of gasoline, et cetera, these push button issues. How, as journalists, can we connect those push button issues that audiences want to hear about? How can we connect that back to climate change? And is it not our responsibility to do so?
Well, I think the connections are, unfortunately, climate change is a story that doesn't stay down and out of the headlines for very long at all. It has a way of rearing up several times a month in terms of disasters and affecting different areas of life, whether it be food security or any number of issues. I think it's coming up. I think it's happening. It's with such rapidity on so many different levels that keeping up with it, with these waves of headline news and headline disasters, is one way of making these connections. When I sort of first became climate aware about 8 years ago, I thought, oh, well, these are great TV stories. They're going to walk on the air. We're going to have no trouble getting these things, getting people to follow these things. Well, it turns out not to be the case. It doesn't take very long for with our short attention spans, stories to become sort of old news, and you're constantly looking for new angles and new approaches and ways to tell that story. So I think that that's a really important thing, is to always be on the watch for new connections, new angles that are coming up, as I said, oftentimes several times a month in different parts of the world. so that you're telling the story or calling the attention to the connections of climate change in a fresh way, and not making people feel like you're doing the same story over and over again.
Great.
I mean, I would also just say, when it comes to the cost of transition, of renewables, you just compare it to the cost of the climate catastrophe. And everyone understands, I mean, this is perhaps one of the greatest roles of government. You have to move in when there's a disaster. So it's costing all of us billions of dollars when Lahaina is decimated in Hawaii, when the Gulf Coast in Florida. We are paying for this. What could be more expensive?
Great. Okay.
Hello, everybody. Thank you so much for all this insight. My name is Jessie Mitchell. I'm with CBS 2. I'm actually the Harlem community reporter, so I do a lot of work in this community on environmental justice. Some of us in many of these newsrooms are maybe one or two of the few people that actually care about this subject. What's your best advice for making everybody care? I know the guys from Miami said that the documentaries that they did really changed the perspective of everybody in the newsroom. I mean, we've done a couple documentaries ourselves, but how do you get everybody feeling this level of energy towards action?
Well, I think it's something that is going to happen more and more, because, as you just said, Mother Nature definitely have the stronger voice in this debate. And unfortunately, even if we follow the Paris Agreement and we cut emissions by half by 2030 and we go net zero by 2050, even if we cut emissions today by zero, we are going to feel the effects of a warming planet in the next couple of decades. So these stories are not going anywhere. I mean, we're going to see it more and more, and I think this is what has been changing the perception of the people. I think it's extremely important, if you love this subject and this is your beat, your thing, to create. I am the director of Planeta Tierra, that is our environmental research unit, and it took me 12 years to be able to make it happen. And now we're working for 7 years. And if you have a platform and people, your unit, that work on this subject, that understand the importance of climate, that bring this story on the general days, I mean every day on your conference call, that can actually connect the dots. That, for example, if you're saying, okay, the Lahaina was completely decimated, but wait a minute, I mean this part of the island have been in a terrible drought for the past couple of years, or that really can bring that light of climate into the different story, because really it affects every single aspect of our lives. It's going to help for your newsroom to understand that this is a very important issue. I think we all need, in our newsrooms, we all need an expert on this subject. We all need, as journalists, to understand the science, to understand where we are and what we need to do, to understand the resources that we have available. We need to be knowledgeable on the subject, because this is not something that is going to go away.
I'd also just say that if you have an analytics and insight team, like, I feel like a lot of reporters sometimes don't have an access to that team, but they can help you inform your next story or find that connection between the two. Whether it's a baseball story, a specific kind of wood that's used for a bat that makes your favorite player score home runs, like, that's endangered now. So, like, there's a connection there. And so kind of finding different, there's a connection to climate in every other vertical. Sports, entertainment, Netflix is always talking about carbon neutral. So just finding those connections and then seeing what your audience is saying and your replies. If you don't have an insights team, just literally go on your YouTube comments. I'm always in the comments seeing what the connections are and what people are asking for. And I think that could help increase the newsroom's interest into these stories. Or I think how, like, yesterday we were saying in one of the panels, where it's like, maybe it's just one line. You don't have that much time, you don't have much that bandwidth, but just adding one line to make the connection. And I think that could increase just the overall interest.
Mm-hmm.
I do find it's the same thing as trying to connect with audiences in some ways. You're trying to connect with your newsroom. You're like, what is this editor interested in? How can I frame it to, like, make sure they see the connection? I think we have time for maybe one more question. I don't know. Okay, yes.
Hi, Rima Dial, WSHU Public Radio in Fairfield, Connecticut. For those of us who work with communities of color and immigrant communities during the elections, these communities rely a lot on news from their countries of origin. And as Al mentioned, in many of those countries, there is a lot of misinformation and disinformation around climate change and what they're allowed to say. And maybe, Vanessa, you can speak to this. How can we better, for those of us in this country, connect the dots better for those communities to understand the impact of the reality of climate change, especially for the global South and the families that are also here?
Thank you so much for your question, very important. Definitely is a challenge. I think that we are going through a very special time for journalism because of all this disinformation era that we're going through. I think my best advice is to really understand what is going on and keep doing stories about it to educate your audiences, for them to understand that this is our reality, this is what is happening. It's not only the facts, the numbers, but present personal stories that can make them understand that this is the reality. On the other hand, when you think about what is happening today, I mean, it's absolutely unbelievable that we have a certain political party that is willing to defend fossil fuels, or to say that they are good and that they save life, or to deny the climate change is happening. It is absolutely absurd that we have to go through that as journalists. But they are, and they are willing to distort the truth in your face when you are doing an interview or when you are in a debate. So I think that we have to be extremely prepared to face that, because it's difficult to be fact-checking everybody. I mean, when you're doing an interview, to fact-checking somebody all the time. But at the end of the day, we have to. I mean, we have to put light on the truth. And if they say that fossil fuels are saving life more than climate policy, I mean, you really need to have the strong argument to come back and say, no, that is not the reality, that is not true, and this is why. Because if we don't do it, if we don't expose what is not true, then our communities, our audiences are going to believe that, yeah, maybe the guy is right, what he's saying is right. So I think it is very, very important that we are prepared to really bring the light on the truth in these times.
Excellent. Well, that's all the time we have, but thank you for this excellent discussion.